So I think all of this is predicated on the systems of power, whether they are reformable and whether they can address what is the greatest existential crisis to face the human species and most other species on the planet over the last, let's say, 10,000 years or something. My analysis in numerous books and articles that I have written is no, that my understanding of power is grounded in the work of several political scientists and philosophers, in particular Sheldon Wolin, who died a few years ago, probably was our greatest contemporary political philosopher, wrote that great work, Power and Vision, and then his last book, Democracy Incorporated, where he talks about the system of corporate totalitarianism or corporate control as inverted totalitarianism. And that's very much like the end of the Roman Republic, where you still have the facade of democratic institutions along with the iconography and language of the state. Under the emperors, starting with Augustus going forward, there was still a Senate, in the same way that there still is a Congress, there still is electoral politics, there still is a constitution, although our courts have removed most of our constitutional rights by judicial fiat, by reinterpreting the Constitution to serve corporate power. There are numerous examples of that: the evisceration of the right to privacy, the allowance of corporate money, dark money, to flood the electoral system and control it. The Supreme Court in Citizens United ruling that that was the right to petition the government in a form of free speech. So that we've seized up. The system has seized up. Legislation is written by lobbyists. And that, of course, led to the rise of a figure like Trump. Trump was the symptom, not the disease, the reconfiguration of wealth, unlike anything we've seen in American history, but this has been repeated in Britain and around most of the world by this global oligarchic elite. And I think we have to put it in perspective. It's unlike, for instance, if you go back to the old robber baron era in the United States, figures like Carnegie, Mellon, Rockefeller. When Rockefeller died, he was worth about $3 billion. Even the worst despots around the world, Melda Marcos and Ferdinand Marcos, looted anywhere between 5 and 10 billion. Mugabe stole about $1 billion. But Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk each are worth 180 billion. This is a concentration of wealth that we've never seen. And when that cabal seizes power and it disenfranchises larger and larger segments of the population, then in Hannah Arendt, you can go back and read Hannah Arendt's book on violence, then this dispossession, disenfranchisement is expressed through violence. It's also expressed through what anthropologists call crisis cults. For me, that's the Christian right. I'm a seminary graduate. I am actually an ordained Presbyterian minister. I grew up in the church. My father was a minister. So I come out of that tradition. But the Christian right is a kind of modern replication of the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi in the 1930s, with a swastika being on one side of the pulpit and the Christian cross on another. It's a heretical belief system that serves the interests of corporate power by preying on those in deep distress and despair. And I wrote a book on the Christian right about a decade ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I did not use the term fascist lightly. In fact, when I finished the 2 years of research on the book, I sat down with Fritz Stern, the great scholar on fascism at Columbia University, who fled Nazi Germany as a teenager, as well as Robert Paxton, who wrote Anatomy of Fascism, to see if these two great scholars of fascism could, in essence, argue me out of using that title. And I went with it. And so the system itself has, and I think one of the attributes of the Christian right, and we saw the connecting tissue on January 6th when that mob invaded the Congress, that connecting tissue was Christian nationalism, Christian extremism, Christian fascism, and it functions as what they call crisis cults. Anthropologists call crisis cults. 1890, the decimation of Native Americans ends with a ghost dance. That's a classic example of a crisis cult, but so is the Christian right. It's magical thinking. And you have seen, as you did in late Weimar, this marriage between the most retrograde forces of capitalism and this crisis cult. And as Hannah Arendt writes, all totalitarian belief systems embrace magical thinking, the fascism or Stalinism or anything else. So what's happened is that as the country has seized up and the institution no longer work, we're watching the rise of this virulent proto-fascist movement, which is hardly limited. I'm just checking my timer so don't go over my time. Hardly limited to the United States, and the forces of public relations and propaganda. MSNBC, these are all corporate controlled entities, CNN and everything else, have a vested interest in keeping people invested in this dysfunctional system, marginalizing critics of global capitalism, inverted totalitarianism, whatever you want to call it, to keep people passive. And it's been quite effective. The voices, powerful voices, I mean, America's most important intellectual, Noam Chomsky, is virtually blacklisted, even from public television and public radio. One of the largest donors is the Koch brothers and the Koch Foundation. So I think at least my job as a writer has been to try and shine a lens into the inner workings, into the machinery of power, expose it for what it is. And once it is exposed, once we understand how power works, and there are powerful forces that work very hard to cover up that reality of power, then we are left with no option but mass civil disobedience, because these forces are not reformable from within. We saw that in 2016 with the Sanders campaign, and we saw it again in the 2020 presidential election when the powerful interests of the Democratic Party conspired to stop Sanders. Not that Sanders was a particularly radical candidate on the political spectrum, but stop him from taking power. And indeed, the largest donors of the Democratic Party, Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, were very public that if somehow Sanders got the nomination, they would vote for Trump. So they anointed Joe Biden in the same way that the aristocrats and power elite in 1932 anointed von Papen. They all were terrified of the Nazis to kind of recreate the ancien regime, this conservative utopianism that is very much Biden's role, as it was with von Papen's, but it's going to blow up in their face. In the same way that it did in Weimar. And we have very little time left, and Roger and others can speak to this better than I can, but if there's one constant among climate scientists, it's that things are unraveling or deteriorating at a far faster rate than any of them predicted. So massive, nonviolent civil disobedience, with the goal being to overthrow corporate power, because corporate power itself has us in essence on a death march, and that death march is bringing us closer and closer to the annihilation of all living beings on the planet. And let me just throw a plug in for veganism. I'm a vegan, and I became a vegan for environmental reasons, because it's one thing we can wake up and do tomorrow. The animal agriculture industry is, along with the fossil fuel industry, one of the major contributors to global warming. Thanks.